Chapter 5, Key Issue 2, is about why English is related to other languages. So we're going to be focusing on that Indo-European language family. We're going to learn the distribution of the Germanic and Indo-Iranian branches of the Indo-European language, as well as the Baltic, Slavic, and the Romance branches of the Indo-European language family. And keep in mind that these are the 4 largest language branches. We're going to understand the diffusion and the origin of English, and we're going to understand the 2 theories of the origin and diffusion of the Indo-European language family. So to start with, we're going to focus on the 4 most widely spoken branches of the Indo-European language family. Because there's so many different types of languages, so many different branches, so many different groups, we're going to focus on the most common in this class because it's a broad survey of language. You know, if you're really interested in this stuff when you're in college, you're going to want to, take some linguistic courses, and you can get really in-depth into these different language families and how they're spread across the world. So the Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family is spoken primarily in northwestern Europe and North America, and it's divided into High and Low Germanic subgroups. So English is classified in the Low Germanic group. And then we have the Indo-Iranian branch, which is spoken primarily in South Asia, and it's going to be broken into Indic languages and Iranian languages. Then you have the Baltic Slavic branch, which is spoken primarily in Eastern Europe, and it's going to be divided into East Slavic and Baltic groups and West and South Slavic groups. Of the East group, you have Russia, Ukrainian, and Belarusian. And in the West and South Slavic groups, you have Polish, Czech, and Slavic. The most widely spoken South language is Serbo-Croatian. Then you have the Romance branch, which you're most familiar with. So this one's going to sound the least weird to you. This is spoken primarily in Southwestern Europe and Latin America. And the most widely spoken languages will be Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian. And the regions where these languages are spoken tend to correspond with the political boundaries of Spain, Portugal, France, and Italy. So the Romance language is probably the least scary section because you've probably heard of the term Romance language and you've heard of these languages. So let's look at where these languages are distributed throughout Europe. So the Indo-Iranian branch is through, part of India and Iran. So they named it appropriately. And so this is still part of the Indo-European family. So there are a lot of similarities in our language that we don't recognize. But if you were trained linguistic, you would see some similarities in how we set up sentences, some of our grammatical rules, some of our word stems and our word roots to the Indo-European language. And again, here, the most commonly spoken languages are Iranian and then the Indic branches in India, like the Hindi. And then you come up here, the Balto-Slavic language branch spreads out through most of Eastern Europe, and the most common language spoken here would be Russian, and then you have Ukraine. Also, Polish would be a big one, Serbian and Croatian languages. Your Romance languages, you've got Romania, which speaks Romani, France, French, Spain, Spanish, Portugal, Portuguese, Italy, Italian. So here's your Romance languages. And then here's your Germanic groups. And your Germanic groups, you have English over here. You have Icelandic. You have Swedish, German, Dutch. And so those are all different Germanic groups. If you get narrowed in a little closer so we can see the different groups that break up the Germanic language group. So we've got our language branches of Germanic, and then we get to our language grouping. We have English here, and then you have Dutch, then you have German, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic. If you look at the Romance branch of the Indo-European language, kind of like we broke it up already, Spain speaks mostly Spanish, Portugal speaks mostly Portuguese. You do have Galician, which is a small dialect of the language here. Right here you have Catalan, which is a dialect of the Spanish language. In France, you have it divided into the Languedoc and the Languedoc. Languedoc is the French that is traditionally spoke. So if you're learning French, you'd be learning the Languedoc. But the dialect in the south of France is the Languedoc, or the L'Aquitaine language. And there's just some different phrasings and different dialects you can hear if you're there. So like I lived in the south of France, and so there are sometimes different pronunciations of words and different twangs, kind of how people speak English a little differently across the United States. And then you've got, primarily Italian, but Italy is broken up into different either languages or dialects as well. And then you've got the Romanian language. So the origin and diffusion of language families can be traced pretty well, and it usually follows the patterns of invasions. And so if you're looking at the language of an area, you can trace its history through its language, just like you can trace its history through its architecture, which is really, really cool. So if you were looking at historical architecture, like you go into historical sites in England, you can see, if you can see the building materials, you could basically pair up like what language would have been spoken in that castle at that time that the repairs were built, because different invading armies use different building materials. And so it's pretty cool. You can see the scars of invasions from 500 and 600 years ago, 1,000 years ago on the buildings themselves, and you can hear it in our language. So modern English evolved primarily from the language spoken by 3 different Germanic tribes. So the Angles from southern Denmark, the Juts from northern Denmark, and the Saxons from northwestern Germany. And so English is made up of a combination of Angles, Jutes, and Saxons. And you might be, if you've studied history, have heard the term Saxon before, because it's probably the most modern. Angle, obviously, is where England, right, came from the Angles. Over time, others invaded England, and their languages influenced Basic English. So we had Vikings that came from present-day Norway. So when the Vikings from Norway came, we had more language interspersed through ours. And then the Normans from present-day Normandy in France spoke French. And so a lot of the words in the English language that have roots in the Romance language, right, that came from the invaders from Normandy. And some also came from the diffusion of Christianity into England, because they would have been speaking Latin as they moved in. So all of these things kind of built English into this really cool Germanic-based language, but with heavy infusion of the Romance languages. And so if you're looking at this map, you can see here we've got the Vikings coming down. Before that, we have the Jutes and the Angles and the Saxons. In the 11th century, we have French taking over England, and all of this helps change and combine our language, and it's pretty cool. So what we can say about language is that language is going to first diffuse through relocation diffusion. So this isn't migration necessarily, this is invading, but invasions are a type of migration. So relocation diffusion is they took over this area. The native, the indigenous languages, the Celtic languages would have been spread to the further up to Scotland and further out to Ireland, Wales, and Cornwall, which all have their own dialects of their own unique languages. They're still in different dialects of English, and we'll get into that later. And so if people were moving in, people started to flee out. And so the native languages also were, either wiped out or replaced, and they also diffused to other places. So relocation diffusion first. So the Jutes would have brought their Germanic language with them. The Angles would have brought their Germanic language with them. The Saxons brought theirs. The Vikings brought theirs. And the French brought theirs. So relocation diffusion. And what happened when they got here all together? Did they completely replace the languages? No, they started to rebuild. So you have relocation diffusion at first, and then you have expansion diffusion in the form of stimulus diffusion. So you took the original language, and once you were cut off from this part of the original language speakers, you started to kind of change it. So relocation diffusion followed by stimulus diffusion. So as the English language migrated with people in England further when they established colonies over 4 centuries. So why is English spoken so widely in the world? It basically bears the scars of our colonization. So when the United Kingdom, or Great Britain as it was called at the time, started to establish colonies over 4 centuries, they brought their language with them, relocation diffusion. So English is so widely spoken today, it's part of our colonial legacy. You could say the same thing for why is Spanish spoken so widely today? because of the colonial legacy of the Spanish conquistadors. That's why Spanish is spoken in Latin America, right? Because the Spanish brought it with them. Why is Portuguese spoken in Brazil? Because it was colonized by Portugal. So language shows you the patterns of conquest over, the last 4 centuries as well. The diffusion of English to North America came, the first successful colony was Jamestown in 1607. Successful colony is the key word there. Successful, so it didn't disappear. The defeat of France by England earlier on secured English as the dominant language of the colonies in North America. And then the United States was responsible for diffusing English to other places like the Philippines. Where did the Indo-European language family come from? So it's theorized that the Germanic, Romance, Balto-Slavic, and Indo-Iranian languages all stemmed from a common ancestral language. And that's really what it means when we talk about language families, is there is a language that isn't any of the ones we speak today, but was kind of tying them all in together. Like the fish with legs, right? So the Proto-Indo-European language. And if you were drawing that in a language tree, you would draw it beneath the tree as its roots. And because languages weren't written down that long ago, the oldest written history we have of languages is about 10,000 years. And so we really have to just look for cues in our syntax and our grammar and our vocabulary to figure these things out. Linguists and anthropologists debate when and where the Indo-European language would have originated and how it diffused. And there's two main theories, the nomadic warrior hypothesis and the sedentary farmer hypothesis. The nomadic warrior hypothesis is essentially that here in this Kurgan Hearth, the grasslands of Asia, were nomadic warriors, and as they rode into Eastern Europe or Western Europe, as they rode from east west, they would have conquered. As they conquered all these different areas, they would have spread their language with them. So the warrior hypothesis ties on the idea of conquering nations as well. So as these warriors left the Kurgan original hearth, or the initial place, right, where the Indo-European language would have been formed, they would have, through relocation diffusion, brought their language with them. And then, as these areas were separated because of distance decay, right, because it took a long time to travel these routes, the new language that was diffused there through relocation diffusion would have changed. And so first relocation diffusion and then isolation from this hearth because of distance decay would have led to stimulus diffusion. So first the same language diffused, and then it changed because of how far away they were from the Kurgan hearth. And so this hypothesis says really that the Indo-Iranian branches would be more similar to the Proto-Indo-European language than would Germanic, because we're following that distance decay model. So the language originated here, the languages spoken in this area are more similar because they would change more through stimulus diffusion the further they were from the origin. The second is the sedentary farmer hypothesis, which gives you an Anatolian hearth. So you've got, the advent of agriculture was in this area here, right? So you've got farmers here, and as farmers are spreading out to new farming areas, and as they're trading their goods, their language would have moved with them. So their language would have spread through also relocation diffusion. And you have the same pattern. Because of distance decay, the Proto-Indo-European language would be most similar still to really those Indo-Iranian branches, the Indic-Iranian branches, because it's closer to those areas. And the further you get away from this Anatolian hearth, the more change you will have. But still relocation diffusion and then stimulus diffusion.